Hello and welcome to our webcast. I'm Amy Pendergrass with Moss Adams, and I'm going to get us started for today's session, Strategies to Mitigate Common Workplace Challenges. We're pleased that you've joined us today, and before we begin, I'm going to play our housekeeping video.
Welcome, and thanks for joining. We're pleased to present our continuing professional education webcast series. Before we begin, please keep the following in mind. You can customize how you view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top right of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons that relate to a different aspect of our session. You can download a PDF of today's slides from the Slide Deck and Handouts widget. You can ask questions by typing in the Q&A window and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session offers 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy requirements. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of polling questions. To participate in the polls, please check the button next to your answer within the slide window and click Submit. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget and download your CPE certificate. Don't worry if you can't download your CPE certificate today. We'll email you a copy in 2 weeks. If attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our group CPE attendance sheet, available in our Slide Deck and Handouts widget to receive credit. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. CPE credit can only be awarded to participants registered as themselves and isn't available for participants who view the on-demand version. This presentation is not legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
All right, today we will be hearing from Brett Addis, partner here at Moss Adams. His bio and contact information are located in your webcast console. And now I will hand it over to Brett to get us going.
Thank you, Amy. And thank you all for joining. I know that you have a lot of other things you could be doing today, and spending the next hour with me is very much appreciated. Also, just want to apologize quickly. I typically like to do these with the camera on so you can look into my eyes and see what I'm thinking, but we had some difficulties today, so we're going to just do this as best we can through voice. But as we go through this, if you have any questions, feel free to enter them in the chat. I'll be pausing throughout this to do some polling questions, etc. But hopefully this we can make this as interactive as possible. And as Amy said, I've been with Moss Adams now for the past 6 to 8 months. I lead our human capital advisory practice. Been in the industry for quite a long time. Really love the industry. Very, very interested to see where it's going and how the changes are, just like many of you are experiencing that within your own organization. Frankly, the organization is the workforces are in a bit of a flux right now. And we're going to spend some time today to really talk about what some of those trends are, and then also really dive into some of the things around what's happening within and across the public sector. I actually, as I was building this research, and I'll go to the next slide here in just a second. As I was building this research, I started to find this really fascinating because what you're going to see during today is kind of 2 sides of the story. After we go through some initial trends, the first part you're going to really hear about is what does the public sector workforce perceive as to what's going on within their own organizations, right? You're going to hear their likes, their dislikes, their wants, et cetera. As we go through that, it's going to build a pretty interesting case in terms of what are some things that you in your organization should start considering to help drive better retention, engagement, and all of these other things, which we'll talk about in a minute. But then the other side of the coin gets into research about what public sector organizations are doing help support and drive some of the things that the employee population is talking about. And so it's just, to me, it was a very fascinating study. And as we go through this, I really hope that you'll get some key nuggets out of it to take away and really start either thinking about or applying into your own organization. So let's go ahead and get started on some learning objectives. So one of the first things I want to do, and I kind of chuckle at this a little bit, I actually put this slide in as a bit of a joke, because being in HR for so long, I find that we are the industry of buzzwords, and 2023 is no less than exceeding all expectations when it comes to new buzzwords. So we're going to talk about some buzzwords. We're going to start with, there's a lot of them out there this year, and some of you may have heard, some you may not heard. And frankly, if there's some that I don't have on the screen, I'd love for you to put in the chat. I actually had this opportunity to present live a similar session about a month or so ago, and there were some new terms thrown out to me that I didn't even know about. So would love to hear from you as we talk about some of these trends. The second is, as I talked about, we're going to talk about the challenges of the public sector workforce. So basically what that means is we're going to hear from you. There were some studies that were done across multiple public sector entities from employees. Organization gathered a lot of this data. We'll kind of go into some of that, but really it's about listening to you and your employees about, again, why did you work in public sector? What are your expectations? Where are things lagging? What would you like to see better? And all of these things as we correlate them back to some of the key industry trends that we're going to discuss. The other thing is we're going to talk about some of the priorities. So I mentioned this earlier. So what is the public sector actually doing? Where are they focused on as it relates to mitigating some of the workforce risks that we're all dealing with today, which to me is very fascinating because you'll see some interesting disparities, and as well as we'll talk through what those are, so and why and how they integrate together. And lastly, we're going to just talk about some steps. Right, so as we go through these, I'll probably be throwing out some little nuggets, but I'm going to wrap this up really in summary at the end of the presentation with just some call to action, some things to think about as you go and start kind of reflecting and looking at the mirror around your own organization and opportunities to help mitigate some of your own challenges or improve some specific situations. So let's go ahead and dive in. Let's talk about some of these fun buzzwords. I say they're fun because again, they're always new at the beginning of the year. And believe me, I'm not going to go through all of these, but I am just going to pause here for just a second and let you kind of consume some of these, because I'm sure that you've seen these. So if you're on any social media, on Twitter, LinkedIn, others, there is just article after article about each of these buzzwords. And as I mentioned, I think I like to call this the year of the buzzwords for the human capital industry, because there are things out here that, frankly, they mean the same as they have for years. We're just calling them something different. But I do want to call out a couple of these that I think are going to be really important as we go through this session. And I'm going to help define some of them because I think you're probably hearing about them. You may have some questions. But again, as we go through some of the content, I think it's going to help you in terms of understanding and getting a better point of view. So the first one I want to touch on is some of the kind of the trendy ones out there. And I'm not going to define these. I'm just going to hit them quickly, but I'm sure you're familiar with flexible work, return to work, future of work. We're going to touch on a lot of these things, right? Some of the things that are underlying behind some of these trends and the issues that we're going to hear about are things around psychological safety and emotional intelligence. Right, those are some other, not necessarily buzzwords, but kind of what I would call descriptors of how to manage the workforce effectively. But then we get into some more of the trendy things that's going to be around quick quitting and quiet quitting and quiet firing and quiet hiring and all of these other things. And I actually, in my last session, I challenged someone $100 if they could say these things, 5 times in a row without messing up, and frankly, I got to keep my $100. But it's just, there's a lot of quieting out there, right? And it's really, really fascinating in terms of some of these definitions. So I want to touch on a couple of these. And I know that we can't interact as well as I would like to, but so I'm just going to say, hey, put something in the chat if you want, but let's talk a little bit talk through some of these. So the first one is around, let's talk about quiet quitting. So I'm sure this is a term that you've all heard about. Quiet quitting has a significant correlation to employee engagement. This is basically when an employee is doing the bare minimum to get by in terms of meeting their goals and KPIs. There's a lot of reasons for this. We'll talk about that. That could be the low engagement could be based on stress. It could be overwork. It could be a number of different things, just unhappy in the workforce. But quiet quitting is really around just kind of taking a step back and saying, you know what, I'm going to just kind of cruise. I'm not going to put a lot more effort into this. What's interesting about that is when we start looking at some of the statistics around the quiet quitting and low engagement, is a significant population within our workforce who are just coasting. And so when you think about that in terms of productivity and profitability and all of these things, it starts to add up pretty quickly. The next one is quick quitting, right? So quick quitting is another buzzword that has been pretty happening this year, if you want to use that term. Quick quitting is where those employees are coming into an organization and basically leaving within the first, let's say, 60 to 90 days. There's a lot of reasons for that. Some of it's just they've come in, it's been the wrong role. Some of it they've come in and they just frankly, culture has not been aligned in terms of their expectations, which you're going to hear me talk about culture a lot today. Culture, especially as we think about kind of the new way of working, a lot of the new generations of workers coming in, culture is one of the key attributes for why they go to work and why they stay working as an organization. There's other things around management, job expectations, and things like that. Quick or quiet firing is another one. This one is unfortunately a very negative thing. This really has to do with managers pushing their employees out. Basically, this could be around them putting on duties or responsibilities that are beyond their certain level of scope of duties from a work perspective, exceeding the employee's work capabilities. So it's kind of forcing an employee out, which again, we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then I think the last one is around the quiet hiring, right? And quiet hiring is an interesting term because quiet hiring really has to do with really nothing more than succession planning. It's about really looking at your own internal skills and capabilities and hiring within your own talent pool. The other piece of this, it isn't just within your own team, however. This could be looking across teams and across functions to find some of those skills and capabilities. So a lot of times, again, a lot of these, if you look at these buzzwords, they're really just descriptors of things that we've already known. But frankly, for those of you who are just seeing this, they can be a bit confusing. So I just wanted to take a minute to share some of these, and again, I'm not going to cover them all, like ghosting. I heard vampiring on the last session that I did live, which, I still need to go and Google that. I have an idea, but I think it's more of like draining a culture, like a toxic culture, but just a lot of stuff going on in the industry. But I'd like to hear from you. So I think I saw a question about how do I take a poll. So let's kind of spend some time and just quickly respond, because it'd be great to get a pulse check in terms of where you all are, in terms of which workforce buzzword do you hear most at your organization? Seeing some responses fly in. There's a steady pace. Awesome. Yeah, I'm definitely not surprised. The quick quitting and the quiet firing are things that are happening that, frankly, a lot of people aren't talking about. They're things that we're not necessarily bragging about as an organization. Again, not necessarily surprised about the quiet quitting. I think we probably use the term around employee engagement in most aspects when we reference that. And again, absolutely return to work, flexible, remote, hybrid working have been on the forefront of a lot of conversations frankly, and I will actually be doing some sessions here coming up on a number of these different topics. So thank you for responding. And again, as we go, even today, we're going to spend a lot of time on some of the flexible remote work, which seem to be a pretty high scoring buzzword. All right, so before we dive into this, I want to spend a little bit of time just kind of level setting the deeper dive session into some of the public sector information and talk a little bit about some of the key workforce trends that are happening. Now, I'm going to be fully transparent with you. These trends aren't just public sector. In fact, I was talking to someone yesterday and they were like, hey, can you tell me about some of the trends in this industry and this industry and this industry? And frankly, the trends are pretty much the same. There are some nuances between each of the industries in terms of how we hire or how we attract or how we do certain things. But frankly, each industry is experiencing these. And if you were to actually dive deep into a lot of the research, the percentages aren't that far off from each other as well. So I think regardless of whether this is specific public sector, broader, I think is highly applicable to this conversation. So 5 key workforce trends that I want to touch on really quickly. I also did a session with a colleague, Tammy, on this a little bit early in the year. You could always refer back to that and you could get a little bit deeper dive. But the first is talent acquisition. I don't think anybody's surprised by that. Across all industries, there's a massive lack of talent and candidate pipeline. Even though we look at this and we say, hey, how is that so when there were so many mass layoffs? Organizations are shifting, people are leaving, that we have such highly disengaged employees. You'd think that we could attract them in other places. Well, in some instances, that's true. I think the interesting piece here is that when we start to look at talent acquisition, one of the primary reasons why organizations are struggling as it relates to either finding, acquiring, or hiring talent is their lack of employer value proposition. And again, I'm not going to go really deep into this because I don't have time, but in short, an employer value proposition is basically your promise to a candidate, an applicant, or an employee in terms of type of experience and development and culture that they're going to be getting as they come and work for you. Case in point, I had a conversation with I'm not going to get into the names, but I will say a public sector state entity a couple weeks ago. They were struggling with hiring. First question I said is, I'm looking at your webpage. I see nothing about why I should work for you. What's the value proposition? And the question, the response was, you're right, there isn't any. And not that there's no value, but there wasn't anything listed, right? And so, we can't expect people to come work for you if they don't understand who you are. And then the other piece of this, just really quickly, is, recruiting has shifted dramatically in a number of ways over the last 5-10 years. First of all, AI has been introduced as a screening tool. So studies indicate that 80% of applicants who apply for jobs are automatically rejected based on AI. And this really has to do with matching of keywords. So again, if you're using a great applicant tracking system and you're not getting the qualified candidates you're looking for, you may need to tweak your AI a little bit. And then the last thing, which is, and people haven't thought about this, right? But think about the social presence. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Glassdoor. If not, Glassdoor is a social media site where employees and former employees can go out and rate employees like you're rating a product and give feedback. In today's market, candidates are actually going and looking at organizational ratings. They're looking at benefits. They're looking at culture. They're looking at coworkers. They're looking at all of these things as they make decisions. If you have a really bad Glassdoor rating, that's a brand issue. And you're going to need to think about how to recreate that and rebrand yourself in a much more positive way. So enough about talent acquisition. We can spend hours on this. Second is employee engagement. I think one of the key things here
just to think about employee engagement, there's a lot of reasons why employees are disengaged. I mentioned some of them earlier: overworked, stress, anxiety, lack of motivation, lack of career pathing, lack of management, coaching, right, which is probably number one. But ultimately, when you boil all of that down, a basic recent Gartner study said that we were at the lowest engagement level since 2014. And if you dive into that study even farther, it says that based on the types of disengagement in whole across the industry, about 42% of all employees are disengaged. So if you just take a pause for just a second and look around the room, well, you can't because you're going to look at yourself. Maybe there's others in there. But ultimately, almost half of you on the phone are disengaged at work. That's a pretty staggering number. And then when we look at the outcomes of disengagement, poor productivity, the quiet quitting, all of these things, right? Again, it makes a pretty big impact on organizations. Number 3, employee retention. Again, as you can imagine, right, having low engagement means that we have a turnover issue. We're not able to retain our overall talent. And this is a pretty big issue as well, right? I think somewhere around 77% of organizations are concerned with their retention of talent. Now, what's interesting about acquisition, engagement, and retention is all of these are linked together, right? When you think about your culture, the type of work, how you work, where you work, the people you work with, massive intersections in terms of these 3 areas. And people understand this, and they're looking for these connection points. So it's easy to say that you have a high attrition rate when you have high engagement. And if you have a high attrition and high engagement, chances are you're going to have difficulty hiring people because those other 2 buckets are sharing that feedback with other people. So there's a lot of connectivity here when we think about employee and retention. The other piece, the 2 common denominators for high employee retention issues. One is career path and development, meaning people want to leave because they are not given an opportunity to advance their career or develop themselves. The second area is poor management. Is their manager is not giving them the right level of coaching, guiding, and support needed, and therefore they're going to go look for it somewhere else. Which takes us into number 4, leadership development. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one either. Unfortunately, each one of these could be a day. But anyways, leadership development, there's 3 areas that we're starting to see a big trend and shift in as we think about how we need to enable our leaders differently. The first is around human leadership. So this is around being transparent and open and listening. The second one is around being what they call employee-centric, which is the coaching, the feedback, all of these things. And then the last one is around talent planning and operations. And this is basically, how do I run my business? What's interesting is there's a big study out there that talks about that, and I don't remember the statistic offhand, but for the first time, CEOs don't feel that he or she have the right leadership capabilities to take the organization to the future. And most of that comes down to not that I'm not a skilled worker and can do my job or lead a function operationally. These leaders don't have the right people capabilities to lead a team to that future direction, which is massive, because I'm not going to work for someone who I don't like. Most likely you aren't either. And if you are, you're probably one of those who are highly disengaged and looking for a job, right? So it's a big issue. So if you can't get people to work for you, how can you take your organization further? You can't. The last quick topic area, which we're going to get into here in a little bit as well, is around future of work. Again, you guys mentioned it, the remote, hybrid, in-office, flexible working, all of these things. Huge issues right now. A lot of organizations are requesting or forcing their employees back to work, which is causing other issues. And again, that ties into attrition, acquisition, retention, et cetera, right? Everything links together, especially those employees who are hired at a remote basis and now being told they need to come in. So now the job expectations are changing. So just a lot of crazy stuff going on. Let's just be honest. A lot of disruption right now that's happening in the overall workforce that needs to be addressed. So let's take it one step farther. And before we get into the public sector piece, I'm going to ask for one more poll. And that is, what are the biggest workforce challenges your organization faces? Is it recruiting, engagement, retention, manager leadership, training or development, or future of work? And I see your comment, Sally. You're right. It is good that work-life balance is not a buzzword anymore. Is now a wellness word. All right, good responses. Interesting. So totally not surprised. So again, recruiting leading the pack, definitely a major issue as we talked about. Employee engagement, again, coming in as really third on this list, followed by employee retention. Again, all three of these are highly interlinked. Actually, all of these are highly interlinked. A little bit surprised on the manager and leader training. I would have thought that would have come up because that is a big cause of not being able to recruit the right people, low disengagement and retention. So it's something for you to think about as you go back and start thinking about how do I create strategies around acquiring and engaging and retaining our people. Maybe it's more about strategies to get better leaders, to interview better, to portray a better culture, to be able to articulate the employer value proposition, right? To be more stewards of the organization. So again, just something to think about. And I think you're going to see some more about that when we dive in here. And if I am going too fast, please let me know. No one has said that I am, but we've got a lot to cover here, and I want to make sure that we can squeeze it all in. All right, so let's dive in and basically look at your responses. So again, this was a survey done by an organization that really went out and did a pulse survey, again, across multiple public sector industries, departments, all of these things, multiple levels of employees, and we're going to take the next few minutes and kind of unpack some of what we're seeing in terms of the survey. Hopefully none of this will be a surprise to you, since I would assume that looking at the list of the attendees, a lot of you have employees. But if it is surprising, that's great. We can talk about this. We can talk about this later. But so why do employees choose to work in public sector? It was really the first the section of this analysis, and none of this was surprising to me, actually. Job security. When I think of public sector positions, a lot of long-term tenure, a lot of stability. You don't have to necessarily worry about layoffs. All of these things, right? So job security right there was not a surprise. Retirement, benefits, and salary. I would say from a retirement and benefits perspective, absolutely. We'll talk about salary here in a little bit. But definitely from retirements and benefits. And I think for someone who's coming in and not knowing, I don't think the salary is unfair. It's probably a very fair salary, but in compared to private sector, it's a little bit low. But I think ultimately, if you're looking for a stable position with a well-paying job, then public sector is probably the place to go. And then job satisfaction, right? Again, public sector is known for providing a lot of career opportunity, career growth, some mobility within across some of the industries. So I could see that, right? Job satisfaction. Again, I'm there for a long time. I'm able to meet and grow with my colleagues, et cetera, et cetera. So really here, there was nothing surprising that jumped out. Now, how do employees feel about their current job situation? Now, this is where things start to get a little bit interesting. So if you can look to the far left, at least it's left on my screen. If it's right on your screen, then you're probably reading it in reverse. So that's my little "you can't see me" joke coming out at you. But anyways, 70% state that they have a positive outlook about their position in 2023. So what does that actually mean? So when we unpack that, right, basically what that means is people are pretty content that they're going to have a job, right? They don't see a whole lot of disruption. They don't see a whole lot of change. They're pretty comfortable with where they are and where they're going. However, now this is where, when it starts to get unpacked, it's very interesting. So although 70% of employees have a positive outlook, 49% are concerned with stress, 47% are concerned with burnout and fatigue, and 35% feel anxious. Now, if you take those last three numbers, you need to say, well, how does 70% then have a positive outlook about their job? It's a great question. And again, it's because the 70% was really more focused on, do they feel that they will have a job, that their job will change, that there will be a fundamental shift in their job? And the answer was no. 70% said, I'm pretty much going to do the other things. But as you look across the other areas, what's also interesting about these three is that some are about the job, but most of them are personal. They're wellness issues. They're family issues. They're things that are happening outside of the workplace that people are bringing in, which I know sounds a little bit weird, but it's very fascinating when you start looking at the correlation between external factors and workforce factors. People are concerned with stress. The number one thing that concerns with stress with public sector employees is their own financial well-being. There's a whole study that talks about most of them are concerned that they won't even be able to make it to the next paycheck. And what do they need to do? So there's a lot of stress and anxiety about pay. And in fatigue and burnout, again, we're not seeing such a trend in layoffs, but what we are seeing a trend in is people leaving. And whether that's they're leaving based on retirement, so that's a voluntary resignation, right? Or if they're leaving based on going and doing something else completely different, which is a huge population. Accounting is very big in that right now, which also is there's a huge accounting shortage. So I'm an accountant, I'm going to go, and now I'm going to be a plumber, right? But the reality is that when people leave, someone has to backfill that role. If I can't find the right person, that burden then goes on to another employee, which is where we get a lot of the burnout and some of the stress and things like that. So let's go to the next one. Why are employees satisfied? So again, if you correlate this back to the first slide, job security, which again, very common, vacation and leave, and basically what they're referring to is they feel that they get a good vacation and leave policy throughout with their position, and then health insurance, right? Again, so I don't think any of these are very surprising. Now, what's interesting about these is there's nothing about managers. I have a great manager. There's nothing that talks about I have a great work-life balance. There's nothing in here that says I have an amazing pay. My culture is fantastic. These are benefit-related topics, right? But they don't necessarily drive engagement. And if you think about a lot of these things, I'm paying into vacation, I'm working towards paying into health insurance, I'm working towards my vacation and leave. So these aren't things that are being given to me. These are things I'm actually working towards, minus the job security, right? Which again, within public sector is pretty common. So again, this is where things get really interesting, and this is where you can start looking at how I'm correlating why I can't hire, why I can't engage, and why I can't keep talent. Because these are they're tangible things, but for most people, these aren't what's going to keep you at a job. So why are employees considering job changes? Oh, now this is interesting. This is basically exactly what I just said. Well, one of them is they want higher salaries. As I mentioned earlier, and there's a slide at the end that talks about this around acquisition, is that on average, the public sector pays 20-some% less than a private sector. So if I can go do the same job in a private company, why would I stay? Now, that doesn't mean that you all have to go out and give people raises, because there's other perks and benefits that public sector has, like job security, that a lot of other organizations don't, right? So there's trade-offs here. Personal time. This is where everything else in here, except for are someone or shares considering a job change, are on wellness. So they want more personal time. They want more time for themselves. They're burned out from stress. They want more time to relax, to get that stress out of them. They want to travel more. Honestly, not quite sure what that meant. I don't think they want to travel for work. I think this is they just want to travel more for personal, which gets back to leave. But again, if we look at the middle box here, 42%, which correlates back to engagement, by the way, which is super fascinating, are somewhat or seriously considering for a job. So if you have a team of 2 people, one of them is looking for a job, on average. These are pretty high statistics. These are pretty staggering statistics, especially for an industry that is getting harder and harder and harder to recruit for, to hire into, and to retain our people. And we're going to look at this next year, too, to see what the difference is. But, again, these are pretty high numbers. You know, what do employees want to improve in the workplace? Now we're getting into some interesting things. Remote work, that was number one of the top ones on your list, right? People talk about remote work. They don't want to be forced back to work. They want to be able to stay where they are. And there's lots of reasons for that. People don't just want to work at home because they're working at home. A lot of them, it's because childcare, they have elderly parents, maybe they have handicapped children or parents that they have to take care of. And all of this extra time adds burden and stress to their lives to drive an hour commute to get to work. The other big thing, which we won't get into now, is if I'm doing my work, I'm hitting my productivity and my targets, why are you making me come back to work? There's a lot of studies about team building virtually. Now, it's not as good as in person, team building and collaboration, but maybe they don't have to come back full time. Maybe it's one day a week. But let's look at the other two, boosting morale and listening to employees. This gets back to the organization isn't listening to what I'm telling them. Now, this isn't a huge percentage, but when we flip over to the other side and look at it from the employer facing in, you're going to start to see the fact that they aren't listening very well. And then the other things here on the far right are, again, mostly wellness issues. Work-life balance, flexible schedules, paid leave, which we talked about the last one, the workload, improved health insurance. That one kind of shocked me a little bit because I think public sector has pretty good health insurance. But there's a lot of factors that employees want to improve. Now, the other thing around boost morale and listening isn't just the organization. This gets back to what I talked about earlier, being an employee-centric and a human-focused leader. Employees don't feel that their managers have their back, their best interests. They don't feel that when they can go and have a conversation with their employees about career development and actually getting a path forward. So, again, this isn't just organizational listening. This is also more intimate in terms of managing. I see, Leo, we did not conduct this survey. The sources are in here, and I'm happy to send you them post this session. Or you can look them up yourself, but I'll send you all will get the presentation. But thank you for asking. So what have employers done to support employee needs? Now, some of the things you heard about listening, right? So we can correlate that to regular check-ins. So we've increased our conversations with our employees, which is fantastic. Virtual communication. So we did talk a little bit about remote working, and we've done a better job. We've increased our virtual capabilities. But 16% said nothing has changed. again, is pretty staggering. Not overly surprised, mind you, because when you start looking at engagement surveys and things like that, there's fractions of things that changed. But, you're not going to get 100% change or an 80% change. They're pretty small. But 16% said absolutely nothing has changed. And then when we look at some of these things, regardless of the actions that were taken, 64% still seeing an increase in voluntary turnover, and 77% have taken additional work, have still taken additional work, adding strain to their workload. So even though they're providing this feedback, being asked, we're still not seeing a lot of the big actions taken to help reduce the employee stress and workload and lower engagement and things like that. So quick Paul, and then we're going to dive in a couple slides into the other side. So what are the biggest workforce challenges impacting engagement and retention? Or what are your biggest workforce challenges, excuse me? And Leo, just to answer, we like to give credit where credit's due. So even though we may not do the research, we know that we can find it, we can share it. That's another. The biggest workforce challenges: mental health, higher salary, appreciation and recognition, career development, working conditions, manager feedback, and coaching. Big topics, fun topics. And by the way, I don't really make this offer, but since I like you group, if you ever want me to come in and just have conversations about these, just call and ask. I'm happy to do presentations to your teams or whatever on certain topics. I think it's really good for people to get this level of awareness out. All right, let's look at the results. 38% said higher salary and benefits. Not surprised, as that was also one of the key engagement or considerations for leaving. Let's look at some of the other ones here. 18% career development. Not surprised. This is spot on. What's also interesting about the correlation between higher salary and benefits, if you start asking employees, would you rather me give you a raise or would you rather me develop you to do something else which will lead to a raise? Find out what their response is. Most people, we are all learners by nature. We all like to learn new things. In fact, fun fact for you guys, on Monday, we were off for Juneteenth, and for the first time, I have a Ford F-150. I changed my own rotors and brakes. Now, for most of you, you're thinking, okay, great, I would just take it to the shop, but you know what? I said I'm going to do it myself. So it's a new skill and capability I do, so if any of you guys need a brake job, let me know. But career development and learning is fantastic, right? And there's people are willing to sacrifice a little bit of salary if they know they're going to get developed. They know that they can go do bigger and better things. So just an interesting point. It's not always about salary or perks. Appreciation or recognition is huge. Again, this is not only manager and employee, this is peer-to-peer. I'll tell you, there's a lot of really great recognition programs out there, whether they're tied to monetary things or tied to points. It just really makes people feel good, right, about being recognized. Mental health, a little surprised that's as low as it is based on a lot of the studies that have come out this year around overall wellness and mental health issues as it relates to, again, as I mentioned earlier, it's not about necessarily mental health issues at work. It's about bringing those mental health and wellness challenges externally into work. Fascinating studies, or whether it's maybe it's, again, struggling parents, maybe it's handicapped parents, maybe it's financially, maybe it's a divorce. A lot of things are really starting to stir up a little bit. Manager feedback and coaching, again, something that we need to definitely work on. And then working conditions, again, not overly surprised. This is kind of as we get into, kind of our flexible working and on all of these things. All right. So what can you as an employer do to help retain talent? So this is what they're basically saying. I'm not going to go through all these. I'm just going to hit the top three so I can move on, and then, you can get this. Believe it or not, though, the very last one was flexible working. Only 28% said flexible working. Whereas 73% improved salaries, 54% said offer or increase bonuses, but 45% said appreciation and recognition. And again, I would argue that 1 and 2 could be overcome by strong career development, strong career planning, a robust appreciation and recognition program. People will put dollars aside if they know that they have a direction. This, to me, both of 1 and 2 equals this is a reaction to an unhappy worker who has been going out and having conversations outside of public sector, most likely with private sector, talking about higher salaries and bonuses. This has really nothing to do about them wanting to stay in public sector. So that's just Brett's food for thought on this. All right, let's move to the next section. Now, I love this section. I started, this is just really cool for me. Hope it is for you. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what the public sector human resource priorities are for 2023. Now, I'm going to go through these really quickly, but I'm going to hit a couple slides, right, that are basically identical that have some cool circles and stuff on them. But let's go left to right, right? So let's just look at some of the top ones. So 71% is recruiting, 65% is retention. I don't think any of us on the phone would argue that we need to retain our people and we need to hire our people better and faster, right? I don't think there's any questions here. Look at the dip, okay? Now we go from 65 to 33% operational efficiency, 27% succession planning, 25% employee development, 19% HR task automation, 60% developing leaders, 15% D&I, 10% future work, and 5% employer branding. Okay? Now you're probably looking at this saying, so what? Well, let's go back to the first two, recruiting and retention. How do we recruit people? Well, either internally or externally. If we don't have a succession plan, then we'll never find out who's internal. If we don't have a good employer value proposition or employer branding, we are not marketing to people. But those are two very low areas on the spectrum. Also look at developing leaders. Now, developing leaders doesn't just mean I'm teaching them how to coach people. Developing leaders also means I am an advocate of the organization. I know the employer value proposition. I'm interviewing candidates. I'm encouraging them to come work for us. But we don't need that. We put that at the bottom of the list. So everything basically, except for operational efficiency and HR task automation, to achieve recruiting and retention has been pushed to the right. Now, some of you may say, well, why is D&I? Well, D&I is huge right now, right? I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on in D&I, and a lot of employees go work for companies who have very strong D&I initiatives. But we'll throw that to the side. So the two primary priorities that we're focusing on, which no one's arguing with those, the sub-processes and programs to achieve those are not important, right? Well, let's just put it into perspective. They're at the bottom of the list. So when you come to me, for example, and you say, Brett, we're having a really hard time attracting and recruiting and retaining our people, I'm going to ask the question, well, tell me about your employer value proposition. Tell me about your future work strategy. How's your D&I approach? What are you doing to develop your leaders? What's your succession employee development process? You know what? Then don't be surprised. It's just the way it's going to be. So this gets into the next slide, which I said we got some fun circles and boxes. This is the alignment of workforce trends in the public sector. So this is the first slide of, I think it was 5 or 6 trends. And again, we're basically saying, yeah, listen, we're hitting the trends, but they're way off. The priorities are totally messed up. So all these things, I'm not saying HR shouldn't be efficient, and I'm not saying HR shouldn't focus on HR task automation. They absolutely should. In fact, maybe those should be 1 and 2, and then we should taper in the rest. Or maybe it's the rest, and then we taper in the other 2. I'm not here to debate that. But, these are so fragmented, and they're so unimportant that it's going to be really hard to mitigate those problems. And then we go to the next slide. Same issue, But then I also align these to what the public sector employees are saying. Recruiting and retention is an issue. We don't know our career path. We're not being developed. Our leaders aren't coaching and mentoring us. I want to work remotely. I want more flexible. I want a radical workforce. We need a better employer value proposition. They didn't talk about D&I as much in this study, but it is a crazy important topic from the research that we pulled out. That's what I was referring to. Again, very disparate results. So we got 10 minutes left, so I'm going to dive into a couple of these other slides really quickly, and we'll go forward. So the three things that we talked about, right, that the public sector HR needs to focus on: 1, talent acquisition; 2, retention; and 3, career development. So really quickly, talent acquisition. What's going on in public sector? If this slide most likely is not a surprise to you, but let's talk about the market challenges. 1, we talked about the shortage. Okay, here's the scary thing about the talent shortage. The U.S. Bureau of Labor said we're not going to see any stability or leveling off for another 2 years. Let's say that again. The U.S. Labor predicts shortage remain for another 2 to 2.5 years. So that means that this problem isn't going away. In fact, this problem is never going to go away. As we look at how we change jobs and look at the skills and capabilities based on the new technologies coming, this is always going to be an issue. And although it's a big priority, we're not solving the small nuggets to accomplish the big priority. The competition is fierce. We know that, right? We know the next generation, I mentioned them earlier, looking for different things than my generation and some of your generation. It's not about stability. It's about innovation. It's not about relationships with coworkers. It's about how quickly can I get promoted. It's not about, other things. It's about, frankly, I don't even want to be here, so I want to switch jobs 10 times in a year. I just need to be doing different things. We're not adjusting to the talent market. And the aging workforce is another big one, right? Which is by 2030, baby boomers will reach 65 plus, and a massive amount of our workforce is gone. Now, if you think about that, that's not that far away. And if you go back to bullet number 1, this puts us in a really bad position. Okay? Let's shift to recruiting challenges quickly. So qualified candidates. So one of the things that are huge right now, especially in public sector, is an accountant no longer needs a bachelor's degree. They need a high school diploma, and we'll train you to be an accountant. I'm being facetious. That isn't a real study. But what they are saying is they're really starting to look at jobs and say, does that person need to have a master's? Do they need to have a bachelor's? Or can we bring them in at a lower pay, train them to do the same job? If you don't believe me, go out and look at some of the job descriptions. I was actually on a call yesterday with a community, and they were talking about job descriptions, and the topic came up as we are eliminating education requirements and putting suggested years of experience. This is happening, people. Non-competitive salaries, I beat this up a few times today. The disparity in salary between public and private sector, it's 22%. It's growing. Not saying you need to increase your salary, but that's who you're competing with. And then when you ask candidates about what it's like to come work for public sector, like to apply, they said it's one of the worst experiences they ever had. It's slow, it's cumbersome, sometimes no one responds. There's no value, there's no process, there's no efficiency. And when I go apply it at Amazon, I get an email back in 30 seconds. Thank you for applying, blah, blah, blah. It's just a night and day level of experience. We talked about this earlier, but the 4 causes of some of the public sector turnover, this gets back to retention, is around higher paying jobs, culture we talked about. But do you want to quickly read this study by Columbia for just a second, because I think it's very fascinating. So according to Columbia University, 57% of employees at high culture organizations were very satisfied with their jobs, and only 14% were very likely to leave. Okay, now put that in perspective of what we saw earlier. 40-some% of employees were disengaged, right? Here, very small fraction. Now, one of the studies that we leveraged was Nat Geo. It asked the same question to the HR teams about culture. They said 67% of HR participants said their culture was average or weak. Why would I want to work there? Why would I want to come to work there? Why would I be happy there when I'm in a culture of toxicity? Now, I'm not beating up on public sector, right? These different statistics, but same are across all industries. So, but this is a major problem. So culture, right? I think it's a big phrase. Culture eats strategy for lunch. I don't have a robust culture and a culture that lives its values, which is a whole other topic for another discussion. Major problems. And again, this is backed up by some pretty big studies. So career development was another big focus. Basically, 22% of public sector survey participants reported limited development opportunities. We talked about that earlier. We also talked about leader and employee type of development and how to really offset compensation and development and what development will do to engagement. It'll increase it, decrease your level of attrition, increase satisfaction, a lot of stuff around overall career development. Now, interesting, I think leader people, we talked about that a lot. Employees, though, really quickly, this isn't a surprise, but technology is the number one focus now in terms of how do we start developing our people to adopt and adapt these new technologies that are coming out. We've got AI, machine learning, ChatGPT. We've got all these great things, perceived great things, but if we don't know how to use them effectively, then frankly, we might as well not use them at all. And then lastly, I guess that was the last one. Perfect. So lastly, how about this? Lastly, we'll go to our last poll. So what are the biggest workforce priorities to improve engagement and retention? And once you guys do this, I got one slide and we'll wrap it up. Thank you for the comment, Leo. I'll send you a 50-cent gift card of your choice. Yeah, they're right on the money. I mean, these are actually, the percentages are, some of them are a little different, especially D&I, but when you kind of look at employee engagement, career development, these are all within 10 to 15 points, right? So this is right on the money in terms of the focus. The question here isn't about, are these your priorities? It's really about what are you doing to solve them? And that gets into a lot of what we talked about to this point. So I'm going to finalize this with one slide, and then we're going to close it. If you guys have any questions for a minute or two, or you can always feel free to email me directly. I will be sending a follow-up email just to thank you. But the first thing I just want to say is you're not unique. And what I mean by that is every industry has its nuance. But as I mentioned at the very beginning, each of these trends are very consistent across all industries. One of the things I try to do when I go into organizations is make sure we're pulling down the barriers and saying, have you tried this? Yes, this is a manufacturing company, but why could that not work here? Or yes, this is a financial industry. Why could that not work here? We need to evolve and innovate a little bit. The second is really listen and act. That gets back to a lot of the conversation, which is our employees have a lot to say. If we don't listen to them and we don't act on what they're saying, that doesn't mean we have to do everything that they're saying, but we have to acknowledge what they say. We have to tell them what we are, what we're not going to do, and why. And there are very good reasons for that, to make them feel like they're being listened to. And those things that we do commit to acting on, we need to act. The next one, the alignment initiatives is great. The alignment of priority is better. This gets back to that model. We can't talk about talent acquisition being our number one priority, but not looking at the underlying problems that drive talent acquisition, or talent management, or learning and development, or pick whatever function, HR function you want. We've got to really start peeling back the onion to the root cause and solving some of those issues. We have to create a competitive differentiator or we will never win. That's really what it comes down to. And in order to do that, we have to peel the onion back. And the lastly is don't lose sight of culture. And I said this earlier, culture eats strategy for lunch. It doesn't matter if you have the best strategy on the face of this earth. If you don't have a culture that believes in it, has the values to drive it, have the people who want to do it, you're never going to execute it. So that's what I'm going to leave with, at right on the money. So Amy, over to you.
All right, thank you, Brett, for another great
presentation
today.
I feel like I just dropped the mic. You know that?
Yeah.
I just dropped the mic and walked off stage.
Nice. To our audience, if you have further questions or comments, please reach out to us and we would be happy to continue the conversation. You can drop a note in the Q&A window or reach out to Brett directly. His contact information is in your console as well as in the slide deck, which you can download now from the handouts window. If you met all CPE requirements, your certificate is available to download now in the CPE progress window. A copy will be emailed within 2 weeks if you have difficulty downloading it now. And then finally, here's a link to a survey for today's presentation. And thank you for joining us. Take care, everyone. Thank you, Brett.
Thank you all. Please reach out with any questions or any support you might have. Have a great day.